this stuff, you're very welcome to contact me. They're lovely conversations to have. I want to start with this notion of the teacher as humanist, because it's had a big strong hold. And again, this is one of those, as we go through this, I'm really not saying this is better than that, this is better than that, this is my rank order, this is number one, number two. I think there are elements of this in all that we do as teachers. I think this is an important consideration, and you'll know that that trend has been through from the very beginning. There's always been that strong move that this is what the teacher is ultimately we're about this humanist notion. Second take I wanted to put on, and some of you will be very aware of this work that came to its strengths in the 60s and the 70s, when the whole world, we believed that science was our saviour, that science would conquer all. And the scientific paradigm was that if we observed and predicted, then we could control. So there was all the work that observed what went on in classrooms. There were intervention experiments that were held. There was a view that said there is a right way to be the good teacher, like there is another planet. And if we just keep looking, we will find it. We will find the right way. We will then have the scientific checklist of all the things you need to do, to know how to do. And it was things like, some of you will remember this, it was things like asking a certain number of higher order questions in every 20 minutes. It was having an 8-second wait time after you posed a question before you waited for the students to respond. It was this sort of very specific scientific knowledge that we were thinking was going to give us the answer. Now, some of that is true. Probably the biggest conclusion out of all this was time on task. That the research showed quite conclusively that the more time students spent on writing, on sums, the better they were. Well, Kels agrees, you know. So, but this was the big outcome of what we found. And so the sorts of experiments that were going on was that we pre-tested children, we did a teaching intervention, we tested the kids again, and then tried to say it's because the teacher did direct teaching or used this approach to reading that these children all improved in the way that they did. So it was this hang up about science. Now, I've deliberately made it simplistic, but there's still strong elements of that now. In Australia, we've now got this NAPLAN testing, where we test children on standardised tests, and there are all sorts of controversies going on now about what the best way is to lift their scores on the test. It's the same mindset, I think, coming round again. And in the States, of course, there's been lots of that. Libby.
I'm sorry, I can't keep quiet. Just reflecting about my own experience being in Singapore, and in Singapore government schools, primary and secondary schools. Singapore, of course, has the test scores are among the highest in the world.
Indeed, we envy you.
But what I see is the teacher as transmitter, the students as quietly receiving, and a great deal of time on task from prenatally through school.
Maybe that's a good thing.
Yeah. I don't see the co-construction, the support of wonder, imagination.
And maybe in the countries where we have taken that trip, the students aren't scoring so well. So it comes back to a question then of what do we value? So it comes back to what do we want the outcome of education to be, doesn't it? So what is the good teacher? Is the good teacher the person who delivers the goods? What are the goods? Is the question. But thank you. I mean, that's the issue about teaching being so constructed by context in all that we do. So let's push on. Science rule. This was where we got up to. Then there's some interesting work that came again. I just wanted to mention this. This work was really significant for me when I read it. A woman writing in the late 80s, I believe, early 90s, Linda McNeil, who talked about the contradictions of control. So it goes back to that idea that we had right at the beginning with Dessau, with Lal, and with the woman caning the child, about the teacher as a control agent of somehow holding order in. And McNeil's work struck chords with me because she said the way we would judge good teachers is that they would have quiet classrooms and beautiful lesson plans. And I was thinking back to some of the supervisors and principals and deputy principals I've known who used to actually walk around schools, walk around corridors and pick where the quiet classrooms were, and they were seen as the good teachers. So I think this has had an impact. Yeah, does that ring a bell too? And my first teaching, the first year I taught, I had a principal who used to ask me to bring him every Monday morning my lesson plans for the following week. I had no weekends for the whole first year of my teaching. I could spend them all doing these lesson plans. Of course, it set me in very good habits about always having planning for teaching. So, again, I think that whilst it's a bit easy to send up their elements, I think of what does make a good teacher. You can't have completely chaotic classrooms, and you need to have some sort of plan. The level of detail you need to have in your planning from when you're beginning to when now is different. Yes? Yes, please do. Thank you. Yes, I don't want a quiet classroom.
Yes. As a Montessori directress, a Montessori trained person, you know that a quiet classroom gives you very good results because the calmness in the classroom stimulates the children's thinking. So I do agree that a quiet, not a quiet classroom with the children doing nothing, just looking at the teacher, but the children interactively engaged. Yes, that is a very productive, quiet classroom.
Thank you. So I think you're talking about not a silent classroom.
That's right.
Yeah, and I just really appreciate your comment because last night we had this lovely conversation about how can you tell when a child is engaged. Wasn't that interesting? It was just really fascinating. What are the clues that you use? And as a Montessori teacher, I know there's a lot of work being done. How can you tell when a child is cerebrally engaged in the task? It's tricky, isn't it? People last night were saying things like, I watch their eye movements. I thought that was a really interesting one. They watch eye movements to see if the children are actually in there. And I was able to say, well, we certainly watch eye movements when they're not engaged, when you see that glaze over stuff, you know, that it's gone too long. So, but thank you for commenting, and it's been really interesting, I think, where specific theorists about what a good teacher is, like Montessori, like some of the Steiner work that's been done as well, have come up with fairly prescriptive lists of what it is to be a good teacher, because I think it's framed within a particular set of values in a philosophy, yes? Is that fair? Yeah. And also about what it is to be a child is at the centre of many of those things too. Okay, this one I wanted to mention because I think it's had a fairly strong role in different cultures around the world as well. That we don't need the outside scientists, we don't need any external control, because we as professionals, as teachers, will be self-regulating, which is what a profession is. So now again, I'm not sure what the context is here in Singapore, but for example in Australia, the medical profession has long had the Australian Medical Association, which is a very strong political group, which has its own self-governing and self-control. They set up a board that decides who will get to be specialists. They make the decisions, they admit people in, they discipline people from the profession and so on. A very powerful political professional body. Teachers, in part because there's so many of us, we need many more teachers than we need doctors, we have never had that level of tight professionalism about it. But quite a lot of the research, and certainly quite a lot of teacher education, took on the work of the critically reflective practitioner. That we are professionals because we think about what we've done, we take it seriously, we reflect back on what the work has been to make our own decisions as to whether or not we are being good teachers. So we take responsibility for this decision ourselves. We need no outside experts. Yeah. So that's another strong one, I think, to put in. And this work from Brookfield, I think, is helpful. That notions, you know, I asked you that first question, how do you know if you're good? Then these are some of the sources of evidence you might consult in making your decision about whether or not you're a good teacher. You'll look at feedback, you think about your own values, just as we've talked about, your own experience as a learner and as a teacher come into account here. You'll look at what the kids are doing, whether they've learnt a lot since they've been there, whether they're happy, whether they're engaged and cooperating with each other, the quality of the work that they're producing. And it's also really useful to get your colleagues to give you some feedback on what you're doing too. And I think, again, in the early childhood setting, you've had a terrific advantage because you're rarely the only adult in the room. There's almost always some other adults in there with you, aren't there? So you can get a bit of feedback from each other and how you're going. For many of the rest of us, teaching is a pretty isolated and private event that not many other adults give us feedback on how we're going. So breaking down some of that, I think, might be a really useful thing for us. And again, this growing body of literature that we've got now that suggests different ways, and that's what I'm trying to whisk through now. I just want to, I'm very conscious that I want to get through this a bit quickly because I'm sure you're all getting tired. I'm tired of me talking at you. I want to mention this notion that, particularly in the representation in the movies, the teacher is seen as this heroic, individualistic person. Now, all of us know that it's not like that at all, that you are not a Lone Ranger. You have to take your place in a school or in a department or in a centre. You have to work within a particular context. And I have been very influenced by, again, this is the Ken Seidner work that from University of Wisconsin, who was really particularly looking at the way beginning teachers take their place in institutions. And work that he did, and Michael Apple there and Bob Connell in Australia did work around teachers' work as work. That we are workers like everybody else is a worker, and how do you take your place, whether you're working in the Department of Health or in a hospital or in a police force or in the army, you take your place within that workplace. And some really interesting work that was very influential for me in the first research that I did was we take our place in different ways. If we're lucky enough to be teaching in an environment where our values match the values that prevail in the institution, it's a very easy mix, and we fit in, we slot in, and we're comfortable. If we're working in an environment where we don't agree necessarily with what the principal said or what the board says or what the general culture is, we've got some choices we can make, haven't we? And one of the choices is what they call strategic compliance. And I saw so many of my student teachers do this in particular when they were out on prac. They would be working with a teacher in a classroom where they really disapproved of and didn't like the way the classroom was being run. But in part because of the power differential that existed, they had to pretend that they had to strategically go along with what was happening in order to get through their work in that context. And I found that quite a powerful and quite a liberating thing for me too when I thought about a particular context that I worked in a secondary school where the principal was very keen on corporal punishment. And I had this terrible experience of referring a boy to the principal because I can't even remember the situation now, and discovering that the boy had been caned by the principal, and I was just mortified by this. So I then entered this little pact with my students that said when the principal was around, they were to tip me off and warn me. So we colluded, the students and I colluded to make everything right for this principal who would cane them. So what I was doing was this classic act of strategic compliance. It was Lacey who first did this work from social interactionism. What he was saying then, what they said then, was what we tend to do if we're in a situation that we're not comfortable, we don't fit the context that we're with. Sometimes we try to change the context. We'll speak up at staff meetings, we'll try to change what the curriculum is, we'll try to change what the rules are about parents coming into the classroom or whatever it might be. And we do that for a while, and if it doesn't work, it's unsuccessful strategic redefinition, and we get very frustrated, we get very burnt out, and I think if we're smart, we leave the context, frankly. And that's the advice that I give to my student teachers when they're leaving, when they're graduating, that, you know, if you're in a situation, certainly use the knowledge that you're bringing, use your passion, use the enthusiasm you've got to try to reconstruct the context in which you work. But you are one person, and if it doesn't work, move on. It's the hitting your head against the brick wall syndrome, isn't it? There's a limit to what you can do. But the other delightful thing I've seen is that people entering, particularly new teachers who are either beginning or new to a context, who enter and see things with fresh eyes and say, oh, why don't we have a go at doing this? Or, oh, let's have a go at introducing these resources. These are way out of date now. Let's try this. I've seen something that works. And they bring about the sorts of changes that occur. So that ends up, I think, in the best win-win situation where that individual feels that they've been able to achieve something, that they've got some power over the context that they're working in, and you get constant evolution and improvement of the context that you're in. So just thinking about how you take your place in a teaching institution, I think, is a really important aspect when we come to put together at the end of this what it is to be a good teacher. I think elements of that are in there. So, you still all awake? Yeah, okay. All right, let's just have a quick look. This was perhaps the last one that I really want to go into any detail. And this was the one that was nearest and dearest to my heart, I have to say. And the authors here who just were standout and who really, in some ways, wrecked my life were the people I mentioned at the bottom. That I had grown up as the fourth child in a fairly poor family in a little country village. Very happy about all that. I'm not complaining for 1 minute. And I'd grown up with an absolute belief that education changed the world. I was totally convinced of the meritocracy. That if you had a bit of talent and if you worked really hard, you would get on. And it was education that would let you do that. This was the way that you would break through whatever. And certainly for those of us in our family, I could see individuals who proved to me that the meritocracy worked, that this is really what it's about. Hard work, bit of talent, you'll make it. And then I started to read, the first book that I read that exploded this for me was a book by Paul Willis called Learning to Labour. And it was about the story of working class kids in the UK whose experiences of education from the time they were little, from the time they first entered, before they even entered, learned that they would always be working class kids, that was their way in life. And that part of this theory, and then I thought, well, that's England, but it's never going to be like that in Australia. And then the work that was done in Australia by a whole range of people, including Bob Connell was really influential here too, showed exactly the same thing. The role of schooling and education in producing and reproducing the distributions of privilege and power that already existed in society. So it was that privileged kids went to schools like the one we saw in Dead Poets Society and learned to be privileged adults. And they had networks that would get them the best jobs, that would get them to uni, and we still know the best predictor of success, the best predictor of longevity, the best predictor of mental health is your socioeconomic status. So this really caused me some major rethinking about what it was to be a teacher and what my role was as a teacher and what my role then was as a teacher educator and my role in working with teachers in schools to rethink and make transparent, visible the things that they maybe not thought about too much before. So notions of the school teacher then shifted for me enormously. So the role of the teacher was to help produce a much more socially just world. This is really what our core business had to be. That we had to work with the least privileged, those who were really underserved by society, and help them to be able to take a place in the ways that they were entitled to as human beings. So this is a very different view now of the teacher. This is the teacher as an intellectual, political reformer, quite different work. Now, I'm not saying, and this was a terrible shock for me when I started as a teacher educator. You can imagine my zeal about all this new knowledge that I'd learned about how important this was. And I wanted every single student teacher who left, who graduated, to go out there and reform the world, you know, to make us all equal, to make the whole world a socially just place. And that just led me to some very severe disappointments, you know, because I would see a lot of graduates who didn't even buy the message, who didn't care very much about that. For them to be a good teacher, they wanted to go out and have a lot of fun with kids and play some sport, do some co-curricular stuff was really important for those teachers. So working out that people will take up these roles in different ways has been really a very important lesson for me about the diversity. But this was certainly important for me. And as Margaret mentioned, my own PhD, my own doctoral research, was to work with a group of graduating students from teacher ed who talked to me about what their ideals were. They talked to me about what a good teacher is. They talked to me about what a good student is. They talked to me about what their perfect classrooms were going to look like. And I stayed in touch with them for 2 years, and they kept getting them to talk to me. And I went and observed what they were doing in classrooms, did some split screen videoing where we would then sit together and I'd say to them, what's going on here? How come you're doing this? Tell me what the story is here. And together we looked at the ways in which their own ideals either remained or altered. And I think it's a good thing for all of us to reflect on that, to what our ideals were when we were beginning and how those have shifted. And maybe they haven't. Maybe you're just exactly, maybe you've got exactly that same view and ideals about what teaching is. So the movie that captures all this for me, you'll be glad to get a bit of relief from my voice for a while. Can anyone guess what it is?
Give us a year.
Gee, this is like 20 questions. You want to dial a friend next? The year is 1988. Teacher is Social Reformer. This is my all-time favourite movie about teachers. All the student teachers that were ever passed through my class had to watch